There is a great and flowing water that stands between the people and their long-sought freedom. Perhaps it is a river in a borderland, called grand because it has always been so. Perhaps it is a treacherous body of water into which even the brave ones fear to pass, from which not all will emerge alive. Perhaps, as in the story, the great and flowing water that stands between the people and their freedom is not a river, but a sea of reeds, the Hebrews called it, with tall grass along its shore, a Red Sea, the generations have mistranslated it, calling to mind the blood and sorrows and heroes who made a way out of no way. There was water between the people and their freedom, the ancient story tells us. To cross it was a mighty risk, not undertaken lightly or without grave reason to do so. There is water between the people and their freedom now, along with borders and barriers and detention camps and risks to life and dignity and the integrity of our families. And yet then and now, the people make their way to the shores of these great waters, age after age, generation after generation, knowing that the freedom that lies on the other side might be one thing that is actually worth risking everything for. The travelers poised on the edge of those waters, the waters that rise as walls between themselves and the freedom that they yearn for. Those travelers then and now have one thing in common. They have all left home. They have all left behind much of what they have known. Perhaps they have left behind absolutely everything they had known, because staying in bondage, staying in fear, staying in constant terror for themselves and their children is simply not an option. Then and now, all the travelers in search of freedom have first been required to leave home. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. As the poet Warsan Shire has put it, no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. And the journey is the only thing you can do while maintaining the integrity of your soul and your body. So it was, so it is, so it has always been. The children of Israel running from the land in which they were captive, breaking away from the suffering which they could no longer endure, venturing forth into an unknown land, home only generations and generations past, unknown to them and to their children, venturing forth because Egypt had become for them the mouth of a shark, dangerous and uncertain and unsafe. Migrants today, escaping the clenching jaws of socio-political instability, narco-trafficking, poverty, death. Each of these forces ancient and yet always new. They find themselves poised at the edge of these waters, wondering what it will take to part the seas and make their way toward the freedom that has always beckoned. And at least for today, at least for this moment, we draw up our chairs to hear again the ancient story of the travelers who came as one body toward the borderlands between themselves and their freedom so very long ago. And we ask, because we must, what it is that made that passage possible for the children of Israel, what made it possible for them. We ask this question in part so that we might begin to reimagine what could make similar passage possible toward freedom today, without more death, more suffering, more bodies in the desert, and children washed unceremoniously up on the shores. There has to be a way across the sea. There has to be a path through the wilderness. There has to be a beginning that guides us somewhere other than this present desolation, holding freedom just over the horizon and the certain peril of Pharaoh's armies approaching just beyond the nearest hills. There has to be a way. And so we tell the ancient stories in the hope that the retelling of these stories gives us courage for the ways in which we must all live them over and over again, hoping that each of you might split your sea and walk on toward whatever freedom it is you yearn for most. What is the way forward, we have to ask? And the ancient Hebrew story that we are most familiar with, yes, the one you may have seen in the movies, the ancient familiar story tells us a familiar and equally ancient way forward. You might recognize it. A kind of collective offloading of responsibility into the hands of miracle workers who marshal their great power to do great things. In the story you are familiar with from the movies, in the story of the parting of the Red Sea that gets told most often, it is the story, like so many others, of a mighty hero who comes and fixes things for his people. In the canonical version, it is Moses, right? The patriarch of old who takes the people's desperation at the shores of the uncrossable sea and declares a way forward in booming baritone for all to hear. In this version, Moses stands in a mighty place, probably looking exactly like Charlton Heston. He is the personification of the great hero standing somewhere on that shore, still basically dry and safe. Perhaps his sandals are not even wet yet. And from that strategic position, we know exactly what Moses does, right? He stretches out his arms. In a gesture of power and of greeting, energy comes down to him from the heavens. Perhaps he says some words of power, an incantation known only to the hero, and behold, the seas part. And the weeping of the people turns to rejoicing, and they walk without a single muddied hemline into the space between the walls of water. In the canonical story, it is a great hero who parts the sea. And it is a great hero who sends that same sea crashing back down over the heads of the oppressors who attempt to follow. In the canonical story we are most familiar with, the people can trust their leaders. And the leaders always deliver on their promise. In grand and stunning fashion, the leaders deliver, as heroes are wont to do in great stories. But this morning you've heard another version of the story. One taught for thousands of years in the Hebrew teaching tradition of the Midrash, handed down from generation to generation and rabbi to rabbi, so the people might know not just of the power of heroes, but of their own great power and their own deep faithfulness, whether or not the hero ever shows up on the scene. It isn't in the received canon, so the Christians call it apocryphal. But the people who know it as their own story have always called it wisdom. In this version of the story, Moses is there, sure enough, doing his Moses thing. He is called and chosen and blessed by God just as always. And Moses stretches out his arms just as before. He speaks those same words of power and calls down the same justice of God. And in this version of the story, when all those things go down, nothing happens. The great hero on his own cannot get the job done. Nothing happens in this version of the story when the chosen one proclaims things. The people of Israel are still there. They are all queued up on the shore looking for the deliverance they've been promised, and the Pharaoh's chariots are closing in just behind them, and the whole thing is more than a little bit dodgy. What is up with you, Moses? The people must have wondered. Where is the miracle, dude? Why have we not been delivered? from this time of trouble, and why haven't the people in charge fixed this yet? The Israelites are beyond worried then and now. The people have looked to the scions of power to do something that fixes the impossibility of the task before them. The people have cast their eyes to the mighty and heard the words of power and yearn for the way forward, and nothing. Nothing. No matter how desperate the situation has come from those heroes, not even when the forces of oppression and death are closing in faster than they can bear. Sound familiar? On any number of levels. Just to broaden the metaphor a bit, because what the heck, I can. Think maybe of Pharaoh's encroaching armies, which are still coming, by the way, always still coming in unremitting pursuit. Think of Pharaoh's armies as the forces of climate chaos bearing down on us, while the way forward is blocked by the seemingly inevitable loss before us. The people lament. The leaders show themselves to be ineffective. The miracle does not come. We have lived this story. We are living it now. There are the people waiting for a miracle. The way forward is unclear. The great sea stands unparted before us. The people are afraid, every one of them. There is great fear and trembling. And then this version of the story we tell today says that one man steps forward. His name is Nahshon, and he is not the mighty prophet that Moses was promised to be. He is a leader of his family and an ancestor of kings. Nahshon has not been promised any magic of any sort. Nahshon does not know the words to any great incantations. He does not hold lightning in his hands. He has none of that. He is just a person like you, like me, like all of us. He is just a person, the head of a family, who steps into the sea because staying where he is at has never been an option. Nahshon takes the first step, and his sandals get wet. He takes the second step, and the water creeps past his ankles. He takes the third step, and the waves are at his waist. And onward he goes, one step at a time, while the people behind him watch, until the water is past his mouth and he tilts his head up for breath. And when finally the water is to his eyeballs, as the people comprehend the very real reality of their loss, then and only then, not when the mighty hero declared it so, then and only then, when one among them waded in, uncertain if anyone would follow, then the waters part. Then the way forward is made clear. And that is what captures me every time I tell that story. No, not a literal call to go wading into dangerous waters hoping for a miracle. We have seen this week, did you see the picture? A father, his daughter on his back, waded into those waters because he had no choice but to stay. It was hard to write this sermon with that picture in my mind this week, knowing full well the miracle does not always come in time. And yet remaining where we are. Remaining where we are on any number of fronts is no more an option today than it has ever been. I know that the immensity of the problem is the wall of water that blocks our efforts, that the miracle then and now never comes until someone has the faithfulness to take the first steps. Nahshon could not have known if anyone would follow him. He could not have even known, though surely he hoped, that some intercession from God would come and grant him the freedom he sought. The problem was so vast, and the risk was so great that there were literally no guarantees, and all the evidence showed that no one had yet made a dent in the issue, which meant that if a first step was going to happen, the only ones to take it were the people themselves. The only way Nahshon could get free from everything that bore down on him was to take the first step himself, and the only voice urging him on did not come from the mighty ones, but from the deep places beneath his own heart. In this way, the only choice he could make was to remain stuck there between the cataclysms, or to move 1 inch at a time until the cataclysms receded. So often in the last month, heck, in the last week, I have felt myself and our nation to be stuck between cataclysms. Our nation feels stuck between the sufferings of the people like a wall of water before us, knowing that none of our heroes or elected officials seem able or willing to utter any incantations to fix it. And of course, I am not saying we should risk our lives. What I am saying is that when it comes to the journeys we must all take, there is only this water before us and the chariots of the oppressor beating down behind us. There are only these people, all of us right here, gathered before every barrier that separates us from our freedom. If the heroes will not part the waters, if the miracle will not come without us, if the chosen ones won't make it better, there is only us and the change that accumulates over the course of our uncertain footsteps, steady and unwavering, into the waves of everything that separates us. As the great Rabbi Hillel put it, if I am not for me, who is for me? And if I am only for myself, what am I? And if now, when? If I am not for me, who is for me? And if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? I would venture to say that there is some sort of journey stretching out before you. Whatever that journey is, there is almost certainly something that blocks your way. Freedom of the spirit, freedom for the city, freedom for the people, it has never been easily won, and the Pharaoh's armies of oppression over all the ages are famous for one thing only, the fact that they never stop coming. And yet each of you is called to split your sea. Each of us is called to faithfully enter the unknown one step at a time, knowing that staying still and silent and unmoved has never been an option for long. Split your sea. Roll onward toward all that awaits. No hero with dry sandals will save you now, but the people who know no holy incantations, who have only their will and the courage to begin, they have always made a way. Split your sea. And together, may we move forward to all that awaits. May it be so, and amen.